"I didn't think you'd actually pull away," she said after watching me reduce effort without any argument. I just matched her consistency level. Now that the attention shifted completely, she's left wondering why the control she had is gone. "I didn't think you'd actually pull away." She said it like a question that forgot to end with a question mark. Quiet, genuinely confused. Like someone who had pressed a button that had always worked and found out, for the first time, that it didn't. I looked at her, really looked, and I didn't say anything. Not because I couldn't, because I was watching something happen in real time, and I wanted to understand all of it before I spoke. She was confused, and the confusion itself told me something I had been dancing around for months without ever letting myself say plainly. She hadn't expected this from me, not because I'd been unpredictable, but because I'd been so completely, unfailingly predictable that the idea of me adjusting, pulling back, going quieter, giving less, didn't even register as a real possibility in her mind. I was a constant, and constants don't move. That's what she believed. That's what I had shown her, slowly, across months, without realizing I was building a case for my own irrelevance. I sat with all of that in those few seconds of silence between us. And somewhere underneath the complexity of the moment, one thought settled like sediment at the bottom of a glass. This is either the beginning of something honest or the end of something comfortable. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Let me give you what you need to understand this, because context matters here, but I'm not going to drown you in backstory. The short version: I was someone who loved well. I gave fully. I stayed consistent. I showed up in the ways that matter. And I did all of that inside a relationship where, slowly, and without anyone meaning for it to happen, those qualities stopped being met with the same. That's the whole story in 2 sentences. Everything else is just the texture. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 26. She was 24. Her name was Claudette. We had been together for 2 years and 3 months, and we met the way most people meet. At someone else's thing, in someone else's space, slowly realizing we'd both rather be talking to each other than to anyone else at the party. A mutual friend's birthday gathering. A backyard. Fairy lights strung up carelessly. Too many people for the size of the space. She was standing near the side fence, holding a beer she wasn't really drinking, looking at the sky like she was counting something up there. I don't know why I walked over. I just did. And then we talked. We kept talking. We were still talking when the lights inside the house went on, and most people had drifted out. That was the start. Everything between that backyard conversation and the kitchen table 2 years later is just the distance. That's all the setup you need. The first year was genuinely good. Claudette was sharp in a way that could catch you off guard. She worked at a creative design studio downtown. Identity work, brand campaigns, the kind of stuff that ends up on bus stops and website headers without anyone knowing the hours that went into it. She always had paint somewhere on her. Usually her forearms, sometimes a streak near her temple from where she'd pushed her hair back with a brush-holding hand. She had this laugh that was slightly too loud for indoors and completely unapologetic about it. She was warm. She was present. She texted me randomly in the middle of the day, not for any reason, just because she'd seen something and thought of me, or heard a song that reminded her of a conversation we'd had. She made plans and actually showed up to them. She asked questions and listened to the actual answers. In the first year, the effort felt like it moved in both directions. The natural back and forth of 2 people who are still building something, still wanting the other person to see all of them, still in the phase where showing up feels like the most important thing. And I matched that energy fully. I drove across the city to bring her food when she was working late. I remembered the small things she mentioned in passing. I showed up consistently, reliably, in every way a person can show up. Because I wanted to. Because that's who I am when I'm in something. All the way. The problem with being all the way in is that when the other person begins to step back, you often don't notice right away. Because you're still all the way in. You're still showing up the same way. The gap between your effort and theirs grows, but slowly. Incrementally. In steps so small that each one feels like a normal fluctuation. A busy week. A stressful month. A period where communication dips and you tell yourself it's just life doing what life does. And it probably is. For a while. But if the dip becomes the baseline, and then a new dip starts from there, and then that new dip becomes the next baseline, eventually you look up and realize you're both standing in very different places, and one of you hasn't moved at all. I was the one who hadn't moved. I can't point to a single week and say, that's when she changed. That's not how it worked. It was a dissolution, not an event. The good morning text slowed down, then stopped. The random, "I thought of you" messages became something I only sent, not something I received. She'd agree to plans with a tone that felt like she was doing me a favor rather than actually wanting to go. She started mentioning things she'd done over the weekend, things I hadn't been told about, hadn't been invited to, in a casual way, like it didn't occur to her to loop me in. She wasn't mean about any of it. That's the thing that made it so hard to name. There was no hostility, no coldness, no single dramatic moment where I could point and say, "There, that's where it shifted." She was just less present, less invested, less there, and I kept reaching. There was one week in November that I think about more than others. She had a difficult week at work. A major project went sideways in a public way, the kind of professional stumble that follows you out of the building when you go home. I knew about it because she called me on a Tuesday night, frustrated and venting, and I listened for almost an hour. Asked questions, remembered details, called back the next day to ask how the follow-up meeting had gone. She was grateful, said it helped, said she didn't know what she'd do without me in moments like that. And I meant it when I said I was glad I could be there. But something else registered, quietly, in the background. Because 2 weeks earlier, I had had a bad week of my own. A project I'd been leading had hit a wall in a way that reflected on me. A conversation with my manager that left me genuinely rattled. 3 consecutive nights of poor sleep and that low, gray feeling that comes when work problems start bleeding into everything else. I had mentioned it to Claudette. Briefly, not asking for much. She had said, "That's rough, hope it gets better," and then moved the conversation to something else within a minute. I hadn't said anything. I'd filed it away. But standing on the other side of her difficult week, having given what I gave, I was aware of the accounting. Aware that the ledger didn't balance. Not in a calculated, resentful way. Just in the quiet, observational way of someone who is paying attention and starting to see the shape of things clearly. I noticed it clearly for the first time on a Thursday in October. I had asked her earlier in the day if she wanted to do something that weekend. Nothing elaborate. Just the kind of easy day we used to love. A drive out of the city, maybe. Find some small-town diner we'd never been to, order too much food, drive back slow. I mentioned it in the morning. She didn't reply until just after 9 that night. Maybe. I'll see how I feel. That was her whole response. No question back. No suggestion of something different. No acknowledgement that I'd been waiting all day. No, "What were you thinking?" or "I'm into it, what time?" Just, "Maybe, I'll see how I feel." I stared at that message for a while. Sent back, "Sure, no rush," and put my phone face down. And something in me quietly took note. Not dramatically, not with anger, just a noticing. Like when you're in a room and you realize, without being able to say exactly how, that the temperature has dropped. The Saturday came and went with nothing. She went to her friend Petra's that day, which was completely fine. I had no expectation she'd stay home. I went to the gym, called my older brother, made a meal I'd been meaning to try for weeks, watched a film I'd been putting off for months. Good day, genuinely. But she never circled back. Didn't mention the original plan in any follow-up. Didn't say sorry, ended up going out. Let's do it next week. Just moved forward like the suggestion had never been made. And I noticed that too. Filed it next to the other things I was slowly collecting without meaning to. Because here's what I hadn't said out loud to myself yet, but was beginning to understand through the accumulation of small moments. I was compensating. That word, compensating. For months. Probably longer than I wanted to admit. I had been quietly doing more to make up for what she was doing less. She was texting less, so I was texting more. She was initiating plans less, so I was suggesting more. She was being thoughtful less, so I was trying harder to be thoughtful enough for both of us. I had convinced myself that this was what a good partner does. That consistency means holding the thread even when the other person drops it. That love means not letting the space go cold just because the other person's warmth is running low. And I want to say clearly, I don't think that instinct was wrong in itself, but I think I had been operating from it so long, so naturally, so thoroughly, that it had stopped being love and started being labor. Invisible labor. She couldn't see it, because from her vantage point, everything was fine. Things were fine because I was making them fine. The gap she was creating didn't show up as a gap. It showed up as a stable relationship, because I was filling it, without telling her, without even fully acknowledging it to myself. The shift in me didn't arrive all at once. There was no single evening where I sat down and made a conscious decision. It was more like a slow surrender to what was already true. I was tired, not of her, not of the relationship in some wholesale, burning way. I was tired of being the only one keeping something alive that required two people to maintain it. Tired of the asymmetry. Tired of that specific feeling you get when you realize you've been holding a door open for so long that your arm has gone completely numb and you're not sure when it stopped hurting. And somewhere in that tiredness, I stopped reaching quite so far. Stopped automatically following up when a message went unanswered for a day. Stopped rescheduling when plans fell through on her end. Stopped texting first every single time. I didn't announce this change. Didn't make it a conversation. Didn't sit her down and explain that I had decided to reduce my effort and see what happened. I just matched her. Gave back what I was receiving. No more, no less. The first thing I noticed was how quickly she noticed. Within about 2 weeks, her energy shifted. Not dramatically, not with visible alarm, but she started reaching for me more. Texted first a few times in a row. Asked what I was doing with a kind of lightness she hadn't brought to a conversation in months. Suggested getting food on a Thursday evening, which she almost never initiated. And I found myself watching this carefully, with something between warmth and clear-eyed attention. I was glad she was reaching, but I was also watching why she was reaching. About 3 weeks into this quieter version of me, she texted something that I've thought about a lot since then. It was a Wednesday evening. She sent, "I feel like we haven't really connected lately. Are you okay?" I put my phone down, picked it back up, read it again, and I almost laughed, not cruelly, not bitterly, but in the way you laugh when something lands that is both obvious and illuminating at the exact same time. Because here's the thing, for the past several months, I had been the one reaching and she had been the one distant. I had been the one wondering if we were connecting enough. I had been the one quietly asking myself if she was okay, if I was doing enough, if I should be doing something differently. She hadn't asked that question once. Not once. 3 days of me mirroring her own energy back at her. And suddenly, there was concern about connection. 3 days. That's all it took. "Yeah, I'm fine," I sent back. "Just been in my head a bit." She replied, "Do you want to talk?" Olmi would have called immediately. I said, "I'm okay. We'll catch up soon." And then I put my phone away and sat with the strangeness of it all for a long time. Let me tell you about Claudette's closest friend Petra, because she becomes relevant here. Petra was one of Claudette's friends from university, the kind of friend who functions as a mirror and a permission structure all at once. Claudette told Petra everything, which meant Petra knew about the distance I'd been feeling, which also meant Petra probably knew about the shift she was witnessing in me. I know this because about a month into my quieter period, I ran into Petra at a coffee place near where I worked. We were friendly in that way you become after 2 years of overlapping social circles, not close, but comfortable. She sat across from me at a small table and said, with the directness that had always been her defining quality, "Claudette says you've been off." I stirred my coffee. "Off how?" "Less available." "Bless you," she says. "I've just had a lot going on." Petra looked at me with the expression of someone who knows more than they're saying and wants you to know they know it. "She misses you," she said. "The version of you from before whatever this is." I looked at her. "I haven't changed. I've just been busy." Petra held my gaze for one long second, then nodded slowly. Okay, that was the end of the conversation. But as I walked back to work, I turned her words over in my mind. The version of you from before whatever this is. And what struck me was the assumption embedded in that sentence. That I had been some truer, more authentic version of myself before. That the reaching, the compensating, the effort for two, that was the real me. And this quieter, more measured version was a deviation, a departure, rather than the other way around. That assumption landed somewhere uncomfortable, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I invited Claudette over on a Friday evening about 6 weeks after this all started. She came dressed in the blue outfit she'd worn the first night we stayed up until 4 in the morning talking about everything. Whether that was intentional or not, I noticed it. She brought wine, which was rare for her. She asked how my week had been and actually listened while I talked. And it was easy, genuinely, naturally easy. There were moments in that evening that felt exactly like the first year. The kind of conversation that doesn't require maintenance, the silences that are comfortable rather than loaded, the feeling of two people who know each other well and are glad to be in the same room. I let myself just be in it. Didn't analyze it while it was happening. Didn't maintain distance as a principle. Just let the evening be what it was. But then, somewhere past midnight, something cracked everything open. We'd been talking about a trip we'd floated months ago and never committed to. Somewhere coastal, a long weekend, the kind of plan that sounds perfect in the planning stage and somehow never materializes into an actual booking. She got animated about it, started mapping it out, talking about the timing, the route, what we'd eat, what the beach would look like in that particular season. Her hands moved the way they always did when she was genuinely excited about something. And I was watching her, really watching her, happy to see that version of her back in the room. Then she stopped, set her glass down, looked at me differently, more serious. "You've been different lately," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it, pressed her lips together in that way she did when she was actually trying to find the right words instead of the convenient ones. "Less available, I guess. Further away somehow. I can't really put my finger on what changed exactly. I kept my voice level. Have I done something differently? Or just less of the same things?" She considered that carefully, picked at the edge of the wine label. "Both, I think. Maybe." I let the silence hold, let it breathe. Then she said it. "I just didn't think you'd actually pull away." I want to spend some real time with that sentence, because it carries the whole story inside it. I didn't think you'd actually pull away. There are at least two ways to hear that. The first is generous. She didn't realize how checked out she'd been, wasn't consciously aware of the distance she'd been creating, and was genuinely surprised because she thought things between us were relatively stable. That reading is possible. I don't dismiss it. But the second reading lives in the word actually. Because she didn't say, "I didn't think you'd pull away." She said, "I didn't think you'd actually pull away." Actually, that word does something very specific. It implies that the possibility existed in her mind, that she had thought about it on some level, that she had taken some measure of the risk, how much she could coast, how much give there was in the dynamic, how far she could stretch the elastic before something snapped. And she had concluded the answer was, very far. That I would hold. That I was a safe bet for remaining constant regardless of what she gave back. "I didn't think you'd actually do it." Meaning, I considered it, I assessed it, and I decided you wouldn't. And I was wrong. She wasn't saying she hadn't known the dynamic. She was saying she hadn't expected me to notice it, name it with my behavior, or respond to it by actually changing. I sat with all of that and didn't put any of it into words that night. I just let what she'd said stay exactly where she'd placed it, in the middle of the room between us, and trusted that she felt the weight of it. She left around 2 in the morning. We hugged at the door. She held on a little longer than usual. "I'm glad I came," she said. "Me too." She walked down the hallway. I closed the door and stood in my kitchen for a long time doing absolutely nothing. The following weeks were something I didn't fully anticipate. She showed up, not in a grand gesture way, not with a speech or a declaration or a dramatic arrival. In a Tuesday morning way, she texted good morning without me texting first. She followed through on plans without needing a second nudge. She asked about things I'd mentioned and remembered the details when I brought them up again. She made space for me in her week in a way that felt less like a performance and more like someone quietly correcting course. She was doing what she was capable of the entire time. And that was simultaneously the best and the most complicated part. Because the fact that she could do it, that the warmth and the effort were available all along, meant the previous months of absence weren't an inability. They were a choice. An unconscious one, maybe, but a choice. And that matters enormously. About 4 weeks into this revived version of us, we were walking along the waterfront on a gray Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where the city looks quiet and cinematic at the same time, all muted tones and long reflections off the water. She had her arm looped through mine. "I feel like we're good again," she said. I looked at the water moving. "Yeah, I'm glad you didn't just disappear without saying anything." I thought about that. I didn't disappear. I just matched where you were. She went quiet. She knew exactly what I meant. I could feel the understanding move through her. "I know I got checked out," she said eventually. "Work was a lot, and I think I just assumed you'd always be there. The same way you always were. I was always there." "I know. That wasn't the problem," I said. She looked at me sideways. "What was the problem?" "That you knew it," I said, "and stopped trying because of it." She didn't flinch from that, didn't redirect or deflect. She took it in and sat with it. Said she'd been taking the relationship for granted in a way she hadn't fully named even to herself until recently. Said she'd stopped being the person who was actively excited about us. Not because the excitement was gone, but because she'd let it go quiet inside the routine without noticing the volume dropping. Said she missed that part of herself as much as she missed what it meant for us. And I believed her. I genuinely did. That conversation was the most honest we'd had in almost a year. Maybe ever. Because we'd talked around hard things before, carefully, diplomatically, with the kind of care that sometimes preserves the peace at the expense of the truth. But we hadn't done this. Hadn't sat directly inside the actual thing and named it plainly without either of us going defensive or accusatory. Just two people being honest about a pattern that had formed between them without either of them fully intending it. I want to tell you something that happened the week after that waterfront walk, because it matters to the full picture. She planned something. Not a big thing, but a specific, thoughtful, she remembered a detail kind of thing. There was a small exhibition at a gallery I'd mentioned once, in passing, months earlier, an architect's retrospective I'd said I wanted to see and then completely forgotten I'd said. She remembered. Booked tickets. Told me a day ahead. Showed up with coffee in hand. We spent 2 hours walking through it, and she asked questions and listened and was genuinely curious. Afterward, she said, I remembered you mentioned it back in the spring, and I stood there for a second, just taking that in. Because that's a version of love. That's someone filing away a small detail and treating it like it mattered. And the complex thing about that afternoon is that it was both wonderful and painful at the same time. Wonderful because it was exactly the kind of attention I had been missing. Painful because it showed me clearly that the capacity had been there all along. That she knew how to do this. Had always known. Had just, for a long stretch of time, been pointing that knowing somewhere else. And I couldn't decide, standing in that gallery, whether that made things better or harder. But here's what I have to be equally honest with you about. The conversation helped. It was real. But something had changed in me that the conversation didn't reverse. Not anything broken, not bitterness, not resentment. Something more like clarity. Like a fog I hadn't known was there had lifted, and now I could see the shape of things more accurately than I ever had before. And what I saw was this. I had built my experience of this relationship around carrying most of the emotional maintenance weight. Not all of it. She had contributed, genuinely, in various ways at various times. But the labor of keeping us connected, of monitoring the temperature, of noticing when things cooled and doing something about it, that had been mine. Quietly, consistently, invisibly mine. And the months of doing less had shown me something I couldn't unknow. What it felt like to not carry that. What it felt like to just exist inside a relationship without also managing it from the inside. And that feeling was different enough that I couldn't pretend I didn't know the difference now. There's something specific that happened about 2 months into the revived version of us. Petra's birthday gathering. We were both there, which meant I spent the evening in the overlap of her social world and mine, which is always its own particular experience. Claudette was warm all evening. Attentive, easy, funny in that sharp way that had drawn me toward her in the first place. The version of her that made everything feel effortless. And at some point I was standing outside with a drink in my hand, watching the yard, and Petra materialized beside me. She looked out at the group. She's better, Petra said. Yeah. Whatever happened, it worked. I didn't say anything. Petra looked at me directly. You're not, though. I looked at her. She shrugged, without apology. Just what I see. You seem like someone who made a decision and hasn't said it out loud yet. I looked back at the yard. I'm fine, I said. Petra raised her glass slightly. Okay. And walked back inside. Petra was not wrong. We stayed together for 4 more months after the waterfront conversation. For months of genuinely good stretches, of her being present and me appreciating it, of conversations that were better than most of what we'd had in the previous year. But also 4 months of me sitting quietly with a question I couldn't shake loose. The question kept circling back to the same 2 possibilities. Had she actually changed? Or had the fear of losing me made her behave differently in a short term? And would that difference hold once the fear faded? Once I became a constant again? Once she reconfirmed that I was still reliably there? Would the old pattern gradually reassert itself over weeks and months? I didn't know. And the fact that I was still asking, that I found myself still monitoring, still watching, still tracking, told me something. It told me that trust had eroded in a way that even a good conversation couldn't fully rebuild. Not because she was untrustworthy as a person, but because I had watched, across more than a year, what she did when she believed there were no consequences to coasting. And I had watched how quickly the effort returned when the consequences showed up. And the gap between those 2 versions of her was something I couldn't bridge just by wanting to. There was an evening, about 3 months before we ended things, that crystallized something. We were having dinner at a small place we both liked. Unfussy, good lighting, the kind of spot that doesn't try too hard. The conversation was easy and warm. She was telling me about a project at her studio that had gone sideways in an interesting way, the kind of disaster that becomes a good story afterward. And she was animated and funny and sharp in that way she had. And I was watching her. thinking, this is what it could be like. This is the version that's possible. I can see it clearly from here. And I could. But I could also see, just as clearly, the year before. The year of the opposite of this evening. And I realized, sitting there with good wine and easy conversation, that I was doing what I always did. I was inside the good moment. And I was simultaneously holding the memory of the bad pattern. And I was trying to reconcile them into a single honest picture. And the picture I kept arriving at was uncomfortable. Not ugly. Not catastrophic. Just honest. We had a real thing between us. It had real good inside it. And it also had a fundamental imbalance that had only corrected itself when I had stopped compensating for it. Which meant the correction wasn't about us finding balance together through understanding. It was about her reacting to the absence of my overfunctioning. Those are two completely different things. One is a relationship evolving. The other is a dynamic temporarily disrupted. I remember the last real conversation clearly. A Sunday afternoon. We were at her kitchen table, a table I had sat at so many times that I knew every grain of the wood, every small imperfection in the surface. Afternoon light coming through the window in that specific way it does in late autumn. She looked at me across that table and said, I feel like you're already somewhere else. I looked at her. I'm right here. But she shook her head slightly, not disagreeing with my physical presence, disagreeing with something deeper. I know you are, but I also know what I mean. And I did too, because she was right. Not in the way she feared, not someone else, not some other life pulling at me, but somewhere else internally. The part of me that had been all the way in, completely committed, entirely invested in holding this thing together, that part had quietly, over months, started to release its grip. Not because I had decided to leave, but because I'd finally stopped holding on hard enough for both of us. And once I let go of my half, what was left was exactly what she had actually been choosing to give, which was less than what I needed. We broke up on a Tuesday. No scene, no accusations, no single terrible thing to point to that made everything make sense. Just two people sitting with the truth of where they actually were. She cried, and I sat with her in that. We talked for a long time, not about failures, but about the real things, what it had been at its best, what it had meant to each of us, how we had helped each other through specific seasons that had been hard for separate and unrelated reasons. It wasn't ugly. It was sad. Real endings are mostly just sad. Because real endings usually don't have a villain. They just have two people who gradually stopped being the right fit for each other, or who discovered that the fit they thought they had was partly an illusion they'd been quietly maintaining. We were both of those things. The weeks after were strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not terrible, not dark, just strange. I had spent so long monitoring the relationship, tracking the temperature, noticing the gaps, compensating, wondering, reaching, that not doing any of that left the kind of quiet I had to learn how to sit inside. There was nothing to track anymore, nothing to manage, just my own life, moving forward on its own terms, needing only me to show up for it. And that required more adjustment than I expected. Because sometimes you don't realize how much energy you've been spending on something until it's no longer there to spend it on. And the return of all that energy is strange, almost disorienting, before it becomes, eventually, restful. About 2 months after the ending, she texted a short message. She said she'd been thinking a lot, that she understood more now, about what she'd let slip, about the pattern that had slowly formed between us, about how she'd mistaken the stability of the relationship for evidence of mutual effort when most of the maintenance had been mine. Said she was sorry it had taken losing something to see it clearly. I sat with that for a while before I replied. Then I wrote back honestly, that I didn't regret the relationship, that I didn't regret the time or what it had meant, and that the problem wasn't what she'd done so much as what I'd quietly allowed to go unspoken for too long. That blame wasn't the point. That understanding was. She sent back one word. Same. Here is what I actually know now, on the other side of all of it. I know that effort imbalance doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. In moments small enough to explain away individually. A late text. A vague reply. A plan left unfollowed. A question that doesn't get asked in return. A detail forgotten that would have been remembered 6 months earlier. Each one, nothing. Together, over months, everything. A pattern. And patterns don't care about your intentions. They don't respond to good faith. They respond to what you actually do, consistently, over time, when nobody is paying particular attention. The pattern defines the relationship far more than any single conversation ever will. Because the pattern is what exists on an ordinary Tuesday, when nobody is performing, when nobody is afraid of consequences, When comfort has arrived and effort has become optional. That's the real relationship. Not the good weeks. Not the recovered weeks after a near miss. The Tuesday. What someone does when they think the risk is low. That's where the truth lives. I also know this. What I did, matching her energy, reducing my effort to mirror her level, going quiet in the same proportion she had gone quiet, was not a strategy, was not manipulation, was not a punishment designed to make her feel what I'd felt. It was just honesty. Late honesty, maybe, but honesty nonetheless. I stopped pretending the imbalance was sustainable. I stopped filling the space she was leaving empty. I let the actual dynamic surface instead of smoothing it over with my own effort. And when it did surface, she felt it almost immediately, which tells you something important. Not about her character specifically, but about what had been keeping the dynamic in place. If she had been genuinely present, attentive, actively engaged, she wouldn't have noticed a quieting in me within days. Because there wouldn't have been enough distance between us for the shift to be significant. But she noticed it within 3 days. Because the gap between what she had been expecting and what I was now giving was the exact same gap she had been creating. She just had never had to stand on my side of it before. And she had no idea how big it actually was until she felt it from there. There is something I want to address directly because I think it comes up in stories like this one. The question of whether what I did was fair. Whether going quiet without a conversation, without explicitly naming the problem and giving her the chance to respond, was the right way to handle it. And I've thought about this a lot. I want to be honest. I had tried the conversation version. Not formally, not with ultimatums, but I had said things, over the months, in smaller ways. I feel like we haven't connected much lately. I'd love it if you initiated more. I feel like I'm always the one reaching. Each of those landed gently, in the moment, and produced a brief adjustment. A few days of her being more attentive. And then the drift resumed. Because the conversation, however honest, doesn't change a pattern on its own. A pattern changes when behavior changes. And behavior changes when the cost of not changing it becomes real. Not theoretical. Not mentioned in conversation. Real. In the form of something noticeably absent that used to be reliably there. I'm not saying this to justify myself. I'm saying it because I think a lot of people have the conversation version of this story over and over, saying clearly what they need, receiving temporary adjustment, watching the drift resume, and blame themselves for not finding the right words. The words were fine. The words weren't the problem. The pattern was the problem. And patterns require more than words to interrupt. People ask sometimes what they should do when they're in a relationship where the effort feels consistently unequal. And I never have a single clean answer, because every situation has its own texture. But I'll say what I would tell the version of me from 2 years ago, still reaching across a growing space, still compensating, still telling himself that this is what love requires. Stop carrying it alone. Not as a tactic, not as a game, not to make a point, but because if the only thing keeping a relationship warm is one person refusing to let it go cold, if the stability of what you have depends entirely on one person's refusal to stop compensating, that's not a partnership. That's maintenance work. And you are not a building that needs maintaining. You are a person who deserves to be actively chosen, not just kept, not just relied upon, chosen on a regular Tuesday, when everything is fine and there's nothing to be afraid of, when the risk feels low, when effort isn't required but offered anyway because the person actually wants to. That's the thing to look for. That's the thing worth holding out for. And here is the thing nobody tells you about being the person who compensates. You get good at it. So good, in fact, that you stop noticing you're doing it. It becomes automatic. The constant monitoring, the gap filling, the reaching across the distance and making the space feel smaller than it is. You develop a set of habits that are so deeply ingrained they feel like personality. You think you are simply a caring person, a committed person, a consistent person, and you are. But you are also, without realizing it, doing a kind of emotional labor that the other person is being quietly absolved of. Because every time you fill the space, you remove the consequence of leaving it empty. Every time you text first, you remove the consequence of waiting. Every time you follow up on the unfollowed plan, you remove the consequence of letting things drift. You teach them, over and over, that their inconsistency is safe, that it has no real cost. And then you wonder why nothing changes. It doesn't change because you keep removing the reason for it to change. Not out of naivety, out of love. But love that doesn't include honesty about its own limits isn't sustainable. It's just deferred pain. I think about the version of me that stayed, that let the warmth of the recovered weeks smooth over everything I'd understood. that went back to reaching and compensating and filling. That version doesn't end up happier. He ends up more tired, more quietly resentful of something he can never quite name, more practiced at convincing himself that the Tuesday distance is just comfort, just routine, just what long relationships do. Until one day something cracks the whole thing open in a way that can't be smoothed over. And he's left standing in the rubble of 2 extra years wondering why he waited. I know that version of the story well enough to know I didn't want to live it. I think about that Friday night sometimes. The blue outfit, the wine she almost never brought, the conversation that was better than most of what we'd had in a year. I think about what would have happened if I'd let relief win that night. If I'd allowed the warmth of that one evening to smooth over everything I'd come to understand. If I'd gone back to the reaching and the compensating and the careful maintenance of a space she wasn't filling. I know how that version of the story ends. We'd have been together another year, probably. The pattern would have re-established itself slowly. Once the fear that had activated her faded back into comfort. Once she reconfirmed that I was still there, still constant, still the same safe bet. And in 6 months, maybe 12, we'd have been right back where we started. With me wondering again, noticing again, filing things away again. Except I would have known, that time around, exactly what I was looking at and choosing to ignore. And that would have been the worst version. Not the honest ending. The one I told myself into. She said, I didn't think you'd actually pull away. And maybe that is the most honest sentence of the entire relationship. Not because it reveals something malicious in her, but because of what it quietly admits. She had me mapped, knew where I'd be, had measured the risk and found it low, had concluded that I was the kind of person who doesn't move, who stays in place, who compensates, who shows up even when he's showing up for two. And when that specifically reliable, specifically constant person quietly became less constant than she'd calculated. Everything became uncertain in a way she hadn't prepared for. Not because I'd done something aggressive, because I'd done something she hadn't assigned a probability to. The mirror just finally showed her the actual picture, not the one I'd been gently, invisibly adjusting behind the scenes. The actual one. And she didn't recognize it, because she'd never really had to look at it directly before. I matched her consistency. Nothing more complicated than that. No drama, no argument, no tearful confrontation about what I needed. Just a quiet, accurate reflection. And what happened when I did that was this. The gap became visible. The dynamic became honest. The relationship finally showed its actual shape. And then she, seeing that shape clearly for the first time, reached for what she'd been allowing to drift. Which tells you everything you need to know. The capacity for effort was there the whole time. It just hadn't been required of her. Until it was. Some people get shocked into clarity by what they almost lose. Some people get temporarily activated and then drift back once the fear fades. Some people, the genuinely self-aware ones, look at the full picture and actually change something permanent about how they show up. I can't tell you which of those she is now. I don't know. What I know is who she was trying to be in those final months. And I know it was real effort, real and genuine. But I also know the ending was right. Not because she was wrong for me in every way. Not because there wasn't something real between us, but because I needed something she had only just discovered she could offer. And I wasn't sure she would keep offering it once the clarity of almost losing it faded into ordinary comfort again. That uncertainty was not something I could ask her to prove out over another year. And it was not something I was willing to test again by waiting for the pattern to reemerge. Some doors, once you've walked far enough through them, don't make sense to walk back through. The quiet that came after was eventually just quiet. Not the loaded kind. Not the kind that asks you to fill it. Not the kind that reminds you, every few hours, of what's missing. Just quiet. The kind you can actually rest inside without needing to do anything about it. The kind that feels, after you've been in it long enough, like something that was always supposed to be there. And I realized, sitting in that quiet, that I hadn't felt that kind of rest in a very long time. That I had been so consistently occupied with monitoring and maintaining and reaching that I'd genuinely forgotten what it felt like to simply not be doing any of that. To just be, without a gap to fill, without a temperature to check, without a thread to hold together through willpower alone. The absence of that labor wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space that I had been so busy occupying with effort that I'd never noticed I was actually desperate for it. The last thing I'll say is about me, not about her. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, the imbalance, the quiet shift, the honest conversations, the ending, I learned something about myself I'd been avoiding for longer than just this relationship. I learned that I am someone who gives a lot, who reaches, who shows up, who stays, who fills spaces and holds threads, and keeps things together even when the structure has quietly started to lean. And that is not a flaw. Consistency and care are not weaknesses. They are not things to be ashamed of or trained out of, but they require honesty about what they're worth, about what they're for, about whether the person receiving them actually sees them, values them, and meets them with something real in return. Not perfectly, not symmetrically, not every single day without exception, but enough. Enough that you never have to wonder whether you're being loved or just relied upon. Enough that you never find yourself reducing effort as an experiment to see if anyone even notices. Enough that the ordinary Tuesday feels like a place you both want to be, because someone is still choosing it, still choosing you, without needing to be afraid to do it, without loss as the only motivator, just because they want to. Every Tuesday, she said, I didn't think you'd actually pull away. I matched her consistency. The control she thought she had turned out to be something I'd been quietly allowing, not something she'd actually built. And the moment I stopped allowing it, everything became visible that had been invisible before. Not with an argument, not with an ultimatum, not with a dramatic confrontation or a list of grievances or a single defining fight, just with a quiet, honest reduction in what I was doing. And the silence that followed told the truth that neither of us had been saying. Some truths don't need words. They just need someone to stop filling the space they occupy and let the room finally go still enough to hear them.